In Janda's Challenge of Democracy, in addition to explaining government's policymaking with respect to the three roles, freedom, order, and equality, he also continuously refers back to a majoritarian versus pluralist perspective of democracy. Majoritarian being government instituted through the view of the majority of the people, while pluralist being government instituted through competing interest groups. And just like with those three roles, American government especially is constantly going back and forth between majoritarian and pluralist. But by the end of this video, you'll see that the American political system tends to favor the pluralist perspective more. But anyway, let's go ahead and first understand what each is. Now, first off, the original system of democracy, as inspired by the Athens of ancient Greece, was simply everyone participated, everyone voted who qualified, adult men or landowning men. So, when we think of democracy, we tend to think of the classical majoritarian definition of it. It's majority rule, universal participation, political equality, and government responsiveness. These are all the portions of the procedural democratic theory that encompass majoritarian democracy. It's saying that in order for majoritarian democracy to follow the procedural democratic theory, which is sort of like a sub-level of majoritarian democracy, it must meet these four requirements. Okay? So when we think of democracy, we do think of universal participation. Everyone votes. Political equality. Everyone's vote counts the same. Majority rule. The majority rules. And responsiveness. Government should respond to the majority rule. But we also need to look at substantive democratic theory, where minority rights are protected in times of social radicalism. For example, look at America just a few hundred years ago. And we had, persecutions against anyone who didn't fit our view of normal. And it can go hundreds of years and we still have that persecution today. It doesn't matter what example you use. The fact is, minorities, not just in America, but just everywhere in world history, have always been persecuted for being a minority, scapegoating. So in substantive democratic theory, we also have minority rights. So the American view of majoritarian democracy incorporates both procedural democratic theory and substantive democratic theory. And in total, it's these 5 requirements. So, when we think about democracy, there are 2 types. There's the direct democracy, as that of Athens, and in some small societies today, and this is called a participatory democracy, where everyone participates, everyone votes, everyone makes all the decisions. This is the classical definition of democracy. But in the real life, in how we use it today, we use representative democracy and indirect democracy, where we elect people and we still follow these procedural and substantive values, but the decision making doesn't come down to the wire with the individual voter. They vote people to represent themselves, and that's the way we use today. Now, when we look at pluralist democracy is defined as democracy interpreted by competing interest groups. And an interest group, also known as a lobby, is an organization of a specialized group who have an interest in influencing public policy making in government. As Alexander Hamilton, our first Secretary of Treasury, one of our founding fathers, famously said in his reports on manufacturing as Secretary of the Treasury, the rich should have a stake in the government through debt. He thought debt was good, and the rich should have a stake in the government through debt, having the government indebted to the rich. So if anything goes wrong with the government, then they have something to lose. So they would do their best to keep the government and the country on its feet. And this was back when we were a very small republic. But his ideals can still be instituted with today. In pluralist democracy, it basically says that the only people who are participate in our political system, in our democratic theory, which idealistically still has these procedural and substantive views, but in practice, only the people who have a stake in the government are really going to seek to influence it. So that's where interest groups come in. Interest groups don't just appear out of nowhere. It's not like they're in the Constitution or they're anywhere specified that government should create them. No, they are independent and they are privately run typically. And what happens is it's just a group of specialized people, people that have some kind of common interest. They unite together to become well organized and they seek to influence public policy for their betterment. An example of this could be the Association of Home Realtors. This is an association of people who sell homes, realtors, and they are essentially an interest group that lobby Congress to pass legislation or make sure they don't pass legislation that hinders their work. And it can really go to anything. The Chamber of Commerce is one that has to do with anything with money. And literally any business could be a part of the Chamber of Commerce interest group. And the way each interest group is organized, it's pretty much the same way. It's usually the better organized they are, the better at influencing public policy, and typically the more wealthy they are, the more funds they have. But it needs to be understood that a lobbyist group doesn't simply throw money at politicians to buy their vote. It's more like they spend money to advertise and campaign, and they operate much like a political party. But what is a political party? A political party is essentially a very broad interest group that happens to run or happens to sponsor a candidate for public office. But anyway, they seek to influence the politicians by bringing them information, bringing them to light with what their constituents believe, the constituents that they represent, the congressman or congresswoman or senator's constituents who the interest group represent. And if they don't follow what the interest wants, then the interest could essentially do blackmail and say that if you, the elected official, don't do what I say based off their research and their representation of their interest group, then they will go back to that public official's constituents and report on the public official's work and basically hurt their chances at running again, or the complete opposite could happen if they follow it. And it's much, much more political than just throwing money. So that needs to be understood. And when we look at the American political system, we have a more pluralist system. And why is that? It's because, first off, the interest groups in America are so well organized that they do a much better job at influencing public policy than public opinion polls could ever do. Public opinion polls are a very good method that does show, that does epitomize the majoritarian perspective of democracy. But the fact of the matter is, outside of public opinion polls, there's little else. Because in American politics, not even 50% of Americans participate. And what is one of the primary issues of majoritarian democracy? We need universal participation. We need everyone to participate. And in a perfect society where everyone would participate, then a majoritarian democracy would work. But because the voter turnout in elections are so low, with the highest in presidential being around 50%, and even lower as you get lower and lower on our federal scale, it's just it's crazy. It's unbelievable how little people contribute to our government and participate in our political system. So that is the reason why we have a pluralist democracy primarily in America, because only those who have a stake in the government are going to participate in it, because otherwise people just don't care. So that's why we have a pluralist democracy, because it favors those who have a stake in government, those who serve to benefit. And really, everyone does serve to benefit, but only those that truly, truly have a major benefit from participating, from lobbying, are going to go and put forth the initiative. So that's why we have a pluralist system of democracy, and those are the main differences. There's also an elite theory of our government where it's believed that only a few people control all of our government's all of our government functions and decision making and everything is more of a conspiracy thing, more of an anarchist perspective. It's not really the case in America, but it has happened in the past. Soviet Union is a good example.